Alright, so the best way to explain the double rater is to explain basically the SlamFire mod, which is where you put the rater into constant SlamFire mode. And there are a few ways you can do this. You could just glue the trigger in the reverse position, which is what I did for the original, but I want to show what you do for the top because it's a little bit more involved. And it also shows you where you have to cut. So you have three basic pieces that you're involved with in this mod. You have your catch, your SlamFire mech, and your trigger. The way that the rater works is when you prime the blaster back, it engages the catch. When you prime the blaster forward, it actually is always going to drag this little SlamFire mech piece forward. However, you can see that there's this little movable piece here. I got like a screwdriver here. There's this little movable piece, if you look, that it's floating. You can tell on any SlamFire mech it's floating. So it doesn't really do anything if you aren't holding down the trigger. But if you're pulling the trigger, when the blaster is primed forward, this SlamFire mech is dragged forward, and you can see that little movement. It's just enough to disengage your catch and fire the blaster when the priming handle goes forward. So basically what we're trying to do is just simulate a constant trigger pull. Now, you can just glue the trigger in the reverse position, which is what I did on the original double rater, but that just means you're constantly firing both blasters, and I want to be able to independently fire each. So what I'm going to do, and what I did on the top blaster, which is constantly put it in SlamFire mode, is I couldn't just glue the trigger in the reverse position because I wanted to cut the handle off to slim the profile down. So all I did, if I remove all of this stuff, is this requires you to do two things. One, it dictates where you can actually cut your blaster. If you look very carefully, when you pull the trigger back, this angled piece, this wedge, has to be in exactly the right place in order to push the SlamFire mech up into your catch and disengage your catch. So this, if you remove the trigger, which I do here, you can see this little ridge right here. There's a ridge of plastic that's a shelf that is basically just a guide for the trigger. What you have to do is you have to make sure that the wedge is riding along there. The problem with this is that you can't actually get enough contact on there to really just glue it face to face. So what I found is I take the trigger that I've removed that is no longer necessary, and I actually cut the trigger in half. I actually butcher the trigger, and I get just a little tiny rectangle of plastic that I then glue to the inside edge of this little thing here, the little ridge, the little shelf, and then I glue the wedge to that little extension that I've made. It gives me a little bit more gluing surface. Keep in mind that this wedge isn't taking a lot of strain, so it doesn't need to be in there very well. You probably could just epoxy putty it if you've got some on hand, which I do. I might see if that'll work this time. But if you just want to go cheap and you just have super glue, that's the way you can do it. Anyway, so basically what that does is that dictates where we can cut. And you can see I've started to do a rough cut on this handle, and you see I've stopped just short of this little ridge here. I want to keep this screw to keep integrity, and I can cut out everything here. So I'm going to cut basically a straight line here, follow the contour of the trigger guard as closely as I can, and then come back down and maintain this right here. Keep the line of the cut line below this and below this screw. Otherwise, this will be really, really flimsy, and I'd have to like epoxy putty it, and then I wouldn't be able to open the blaster again. So that's basically how the constant SlamFire mod works in essence.